So we left off talking about comparative anatomy and the difference between analogous and homologous structures. And we're going now to talk about homology and analogy. But before we do that, I'd like to pause and take a parenthetical aside and look at, instead of looking at biology, let's look at human culture and the use of homologies to deduce evolutionary relationships in human culture, because human cultures evolve just as biological organisms evolve. So if we choose two aspects of human culture that are ubiquitous, namely religion and language, and let's start with languages down here first. We can deduce we know the history actually of the evolution of various languages. The Germanic, Lithuanian, and Slavic languages are fairly closely related, especially the Lithuanian and Slavic languages. We know that the Celtic and Italic languages are relatively close. Albanian and Greek are close, as are Iranian language and Indic languages. And all of these modern languages illustrated in this slide had a common origin in the ancient Indo-European language. This has been well worked out by etymologists, people who study the evolution and history of languages. But let's imagine that you did not know this history as worked out by etymologists, and you just arrived from another planet and noticed that humans have a variety of human languages and wanted to know how they were related to each other. You could examine the similarities in these languages and study their similarities and deduce by the degree of similarity that there is homology there. That is, there was a recent common ancestor, relatively recent, for the Lithuanian and Slavic languages. Because they're so closely aligned, they have functional similarities. And therefore, those similarities, that high degree of similarity, indicates a recent common ancestor. Whereas, comparing Germanic and, say, Lithuanian, you see similarities there, but not as strong, or not as many similarities as you do between Lithuanian and Slavic. That is, the Germanic language has less homology to the Lithuanian language than the Lithuanian language has to the Slavic language. And therefore, you can deduce that the Germanic language and the Lithuanian language had a common ancestor, but at a more distant past than the Slavic language and Lithuanian language had an ancestor, a common ancestor. And likewise, you can apply that reasoning elsewhere here. So you're using homology, similarity, in an aspect of human culture, in this case, language, to deduce the evolutionary relationships of language. And you can actually apply the same thing to religion. We know the history of the major branches in Christianity. We know that, for example, there was a great schism where the Western rites and Roman Catholicism diverged from the Eastern Orthodox Church. It was an 11th century schism. Before that, there was a common ancestor. And after divergence, these two branches of Christianity split off, and there are differences between them. At the Reformation, begun by Martin Luther, in the 16th century, Protestantism broke off from Catholicism. And actually, in biological terms, there was quite an adaptive radiation. If you look at the extant living numbers of Protestantism, it's near 10,000 different versions of Protestantism that exist in today's world. And you can order the evolutionary history of the different Protestant religions, for example, based on their similarity of texts, based on their similarity of rituals. And you can deduce evolutionary relationships and kinship of these various religions based on their degree of similarity. In other words, based on their homology. And the degree of homology, the stronger the homology, the more closely related to religions are, the more recent their divergence from each other has been. Whereas if you were to compare, for example, the Nestorians, the Assyrian Church of the East, with, let's say, Anglicanism, they're much more divergent than our, let's say, Anglicanism from major sects of Protestantism. So here again, we can use homology, use similarity to deduce common evolutionary ancestors for human cultural features. And now we can apply the same reasoning to looking at homologous structures in the evolution of biological organisms. So here we're comparing human, cat, bat, porpoise, and horse with respect to their forelimbs. This is the human arm. This is the front leg of a cat. The wing of a bat is the bat's forelimb. Bats have hind limbs too, but the wing is the forelimb. Porpoises have their front flippers are derived from the tetrapod forelimb, just as all these are. And the same with the horse. We're looking at the front leg of a horse here. And what you see are profound similarities in the bones that you find here. You can find the same representatives in all these different diverse mammals. But you see that there has been modification, descent with modification. So the homologous bones are recognizable here, suggesting a common ancestor at some point in the past that gave rise to all these organisms that we're looking at. They shared a common ancestor, and that common ancestor was a tetrapod with hind limbs and forelimbs. So we can see the homologies that indicate a common evolutionary past here. Let's take another example and go in a little more detail. So here we're looking at identifying the bones in the forelimbs of various organisms, a turtle, a dolphin, human arm again, and horse front leg. And here we have the wing of a bat and the wing of a chicken. Again, and to reemphasize and to review, we can see homologies in that the same bones are present essentially in all these divergent mammals, indicating a common evolutionary history. The radius and ulna, for example, can be found in turtles and are also found in humans and have been modified greatly in the horse, but nevertheless are there. Modified in the chicken, but are there, and are there in the bat as well. So here we have an example of tetrapod forelimb homology. And in terms of forelimbs, it's clearly evident using deductive reasoning that these forelimbs are all derived from a forelimb that was present in a common ancestor. So as forelimbs, we have all these forelimbs are homologous to each other. However, there's a point now to draw between homology and analogy. And let's consider let's consider the bird wing and the bat wing. They are homologous based on the bone anatomy. The bat wing, the forelimb of the bat, and the chicken wing, the forelimb of a chicken, are homologous forelimbs. But in terms of flighted organs, that is wings, the organs that allow for flight, these are not homologous wings. Because in order for them to be homologous, you would have had to have a flighted common ancestor. We'll say an ancestor with a superscript F that means it was flighted. And that ancestor would then have given rise to bats and birds, both of which are flighted. If that were the case, then these would be homologous flight structures. But that is not the case. Bats and birds evolved flight independently of each other. That is to say, yes, bats and birds at some point in the past shared a common ancestor, just like we shared a common ancestor with bats and birds, an ancient tetrapod. But in the case of birds and bats evolved from a mammalian lineage. Let's say bats are here, and let's just say this is the mammalian lineage here. Bats evolved along a mammalian lineage, where let's say this is the lineage through reptiles that led to birds, like the chicken here. And bats evolved flight much later than the divergence of the lineage that went to birds and mammals. So there were bats and birds, it's true, and we could say humans are up here if we want to. Bats and birds and humans, let's say, shared a common ancestor. But in terms of flight, bats and birds evolved wings. We'll just say they evolved flight there and there. They evolved flight independently. Bats evolved their wings independently of bird wings. They did not have a common ancestor that was flighted. In fact, their common ancestor was not flighted. And even ancestors say that would separate bats from other mammals, that ancestor was not flighted as well. So because these structures, the wing structures of birds and bats, were developed as flighted organs independently of each other, they are analogous structures in terms of flight. They are homologous structures in terms of the vertebrate forelimb, but they are analogous structures as flight organs. Alrighty. So let's move on. And here's one more quick example. We can even see the homology that exists in pterosaurs, a dinosaur, a flighted dinosaur, and a bat and a bird. We can see homologous bones in the case of fossil bones of the pterosaur and present-day bat and bird bones. We can see these homologies in terms of bones. But again, in terms of wings, these are analogous structures, not homologous structures. The pterosaurs developed flight completely independently of the lineage that would eventually evolve into birds. And as we've already said, bats developed flight much later than, late in evolution, after the mammals had already been well developed, and bats broke off as a branch of the mammalian lineage.